going to switch to English then. So I'm going to present some influence that have affected my work, but also how a work that started as an architectural practice and through an architectural education started to derive into the quite organically. But I'm going to try to explain those influences, and then I'm going to focus on a single project that I think explains quite clearly the specific challenges that we have, particularly in the context of Colombia, to deal with landscape as a design medium at large scale. So basically, my work has been about a competition worried. Through these competitions, basically, I have been trying to reframe the limitations of architecture, because most of these competitions are originally competitions for buildings, and through a series of connected exercises that I like to call them research through design, because that's what they are, also because they share many themes. I have been trying to instigate ideas about landscape in a context that really doesn't ask for it in the context of these projects. There are some clear influences. I want to focus on the Latin American influence that have affected my work. This is an image that is quite powerful, a photograph that I took in Sao Paulo some years ago from a drawing that I haven't been able to find anywhere else, that is basically a speculative project by Sergio Bernardes from his laboratory for conceptual investigations in Brazil, in which this is 80s, so it's a late stage of his work in which he's revising Brasilia and thinking what will happen if the whole country will be colonized by this series of cities separated by 400 kilometers, in which each one of these will behave as a sort of aqueduct. In his architectural explorations, this is again Sergio Bernardes, also dealing with questions about landscape and a certain kind of tropical architecture. For example, this is the pavilion that he built together with Roberto Burlemarx in Belgium, in which this kind of balloon roof will open the space actually for this garden by Burlemarx to be functional. All the way to artwork. In this case, this is by my father, Rodrigo Callejas. He painted this in 1972. Super Studio Continuous Monument is 69, so this is separated by only some years. There were some Latin American artists that were probably looking at the same references. I mean artists like Gege or of course the work of Carl André. But I believe, and of course in the case of myself, because of what was going on in my domestic life, that this reference came through our context, particularly in Medellín, through art, rather than through architecture and of course through landscape architecture. Silvia Mujica, my mother, architect that refused to work as an architect, and it was the most similar thing to art that her parents let her study. And for 30 years painting tropical vegetation, particularly in Caracas, and with a lot of attention on how the representation of specific tropical plants, even though she's focusing almost at a botanical scale, she practiced botanical illustration for some time, was actually about the reflection of light and how weather and context could be reflected on the surfaces of these plants. So from pure white to different kinds of greens. So I do think that these paintings were about the landscape around the plants rather than the plants themselves as botanical individuals. My own work in photography, that is really how I started to get into landscape, through a search for landscapes that are heavily intervened and deformed, and in many cases quite dramatically transformed by humans, of course, but that contain certain types of interventions that are not necessarily author architecture, that I am interested in decontextualizing and using in my own projects. So I showed you two images. One is Iceland, one is Australia, the ocean pools on this one, which is in Iceland again, and ocean pools in Australia. So what I get from these images, which by the way I have get many of these in my trips to Chile, so there are many Chilean landscapes that have ended up in some of my projects. They, in some cases, are quite literal translations of form geometry, as in the case of the pools in Australia, but are also basically the raw material for the production of graphic work. So I'm interested in representation and image as landscape. I think if there's something that we cannot distinguish between North American theories and, let's say, Latin theories, or in this case Spanish, for example, Javier Maderuelo, is that image is inseparable of landscape. So for me the big question is how you deal with that when you ask questions about urbanism and city, and ultimately about beauty and aesthetics. My project in Medellín, together with Edgar Mazo and Sebastián Mejía, was trying to deal with that, a commission that was originally a project for a building that was closed, that was the first project that we tried to reframe the brief and really think how this commission that was intended to be enclosed in a box, what will be the result if this will be an open-air project, more similar to a park rather than a professional facility, but still, of course, following the rules of the brief and behaving as a building, all the way to extremely architectural commissions. For example, the stadium in Bogota, in which we thought about this as a landscape first through a graphic strategy that will dissolve the perception of type, but also with an extremely porous ring that, as it is perceived from some of these narrow streets, will stop being look like a stadium, but also behave as a kind of elevated public space with more or less the same proportions of the highline. And switching to the single project that I'm showing in detail, this is of course 8,000 kilometers of the ambient change in Colombia. They're split in three. Medellín is more or less in the middle of this chain. This is the Aburrá Valley of Medellín. Almost 4 million people live in this hole. Literally, it's 1,000-meter difference between the lower part of the valley and the mountains. It rains a lot. This spot here, one of the rainiest areas in the world. And this is the first time, and probably only time, where an ambitious master plan has been tried to apply to the city of Medellín. So this is Wiener and Sert that worked between 1948 and 1953 into basically using Medellín, Cali, Tumaco, and a couple more cities in Colombia as a laboratory for design. So that's when they basically define that the river will be this main infrastructural system of the city, quite literally. So it will behave as the main guide for the highway. In 2013, there was a competition for the landscape of this river, and how could we use landscape as a way to dissolve the problem that the canalization of this river has created, but also the decision of having the main infrastructure in the city on the two sides of this river. I was educated in the early 2000s until 2005, and basically CERT was always presented to us as a kind of devil. So there was always this idea that whatever we do, we should really criticize quite strongly that plan. But what happened really with CERT's ideas in Medellín is that only the most engineered aspect of his master plan were implemented, while actually he and Wiener had a quite interesting sensitivity towards the hydric system that is defined not by the river but rather the creeks. So we started by looking at the intersections of those creeks and streams, which are, Alejandro says 200, we mapped 53, which means that many of these are actually on the ground, and buildings. So we were interested in the capacity of a certain type of architecture to revitalize the creek, having in mind that the public administration will not have landscape interventions in the actual creeks, but rather the river. And the idea with this was basically acknowledging that even though we wanted a landscape, the resources of the city, the construction companies, and the impetus behind the project was probably only capable to respond with buildings. So we were trying also to build up on the recent intelligence of the city of creating children gardens and libraries, and basically distributing these interventions along the river, and thinking what will happen if rather than doing a project for a river that is not really a river, is nothing else than a canal, that actually is quite difficult to recover, at least with the scope of the competition, we would place a series of interventions that will basically catalyze the recovery of the intersections of the creeks and the river. So it was basically about different types of architecture that will, in the future, hopefully, through a new series of competitions, recover the relationship between the creeks and the slopes. So what we gave as answer to the brief was basically a project that will mean, or will hopefully become, the new series of competitions to be implemented in the city of Medellín. So this building, for example, is just a placeholder, but it's what we imagine every future building along the river could be and should be, which is basically a sort of infrastructure that will be able to deal with the water coming from the creek rather than the water coming from the river. Of course, in the central aspect, central part of the valley, we had to design at that scale and present a sort of vision for that as a park. But again, we were all the time working and focusing on how these series of interventions, connected with the ones that have been already developed on top of the slopes, will catalyze the production of these, the design of these parks. This image, I think is interesting because, as it was described in the brief, which is usually the big challenge that we have in Latin America, it was quite nostalgic. It was about recovering this river that is not meandered anymore, that was transformed in a continuous canal, 27-kilometer long. But ultimately, the capacity of the teams of engineers and construction companies as we have right now in Medellín are not capable to pull off that project. So where is it that we should focus the efforts of this design? Perhaps it's not in the river itself, but on the two sides, on parks with very specific themes, like these ones that we see here, that are fed with water from the creeks rather than with water from the river. Some of these creeks, 2/3 of them are actually quite clean. So all these exercises on remediation and cleanup strategies will be easier to implement in the creeks rather than the river. And in the northernmost areas where traditionally all this pollution has ended up, and more often we could have more, let's say, contemporary approaches to remediation. Thank you.